Hi Wolves, today we're making a Brostep song. It sounds like this. In this video, I'm going to be showing you all the different basses and drums and layers and processing that go into making a song like this. If you want to stream the finished version of the song, I will put a link in the description. For now, let's get into it. This is what the intro sounds like. It starts out with a low impact, just to add some bass textures. There's a shaker Foley in here just to add some space, and a cymbal swell to transition out, and then a downlifter also. There's a respace in the beginning that we bring in with low pass automations. And there are some glitches. And these glitches will actually be used as a lead in the drop. And so I'm just teasing them here a little bit to get the listener familiar with them. So when they hear it in the drop, it's not the first time that they hear it. There's a vocal sample at the end from some type of sample collection for people who host rap battles, I think, or scratch battles, something like that. And we transition into the verse. The first verse sounds like this. The main lead here is this triangle. And I have a YouTube short about how to make this if you want to see that, but it's basically in Serum you get a triangle and you automate the fine pitch with an LFO, and then you create a macro to change the amount that it's sliding, but you got to make sure you slide it every note. And then I also used the AU5 trick where you resample to a wavetable, and then you can control the amount of detuning based on the note number. So some of you might have seen that video that AU5 posted. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's pretty cool. In the video he was using it for a respace. I used it for this sound, and it kind of gives a different feel for every note that is played depending on the pitch of the note or the note number. I originally tried that for the respace also, but I couldn't get it to sound good, so I went back to basically the same thing without that. The respace is detuned, but I kept losing kind of the emphasis in the low end and the consistency when it was detuned, so I kind of went back to a more basic respace, and then I had to really crank it up with multiband compression. It really just wasn't loud enough, and so I just kind of slammed it into a compressor and then clipped it, and that was able to make it loud enough. Sometimes when you're making Brostep, you need to just turn things up really far and then dial it back after. A lot of the times you want to start with it too loud and then figure out how far back you want to dial it in. The drums in the first verse are pretty simple. There's just a kick and a snare and a shaker. And a lot of the times in the verses of these songs, I'll have the kick mostly just to have something for everything to sidechain to give it a little bit more rhythm when it's sidechained. And then sometimes the second verse I won't have that, so it sounds a little bit more atmospheric without the kick, without the sidechain. And then this drum loop with the percussion and the shaker, it's mostly here just to give it a little bit more rhythm and a little bit of space. As we transition into the build, that lead is going to get pitched down, and that sounds like this. So the way this works is the amount of modulation for the fine tuning on this lead is increasing as it's getting pitched down. I used a shifter with a macro on the coarse pitch and on the amount of modulation to pitch it down and at the same time increase the amount of modulation on the fine pitch. You can kind of hear that here. The pitch is changing, it's going up and down more as it's being pitched down. And then the second half is reversed. I'm bringing the pitch up and bringing the amount of modulation down. There's some tonal ambiance here for the build. And the second half, it's being pitched up 1 octave. And this is mostly here because I had it in the second verse when it plays more of a lead role. And it sounded good in the second build, so I just added it here in the first build to kind of give a little bit more space to the build-up to kind of just fill out the frequency spectrum more. The build is the same kick from the verse. A slightly different drum loop for the percussion. I'm controlling the amount of width in this percussion loop with an envelope follower and a mid-side EQ. So as the loop is more quiet, it's thinner, and as it's louder, you still get the width of the snare and the shaker. But it was really, really loud, which is good, but I don't want it to be too loud, so I'm using this to kind of control it to get the best of both the width and the control. Second half of the build has a snare. It is just a snare playing a lot of notes really quick, and it's being pitched up over time with a really aggressive bandpass that the frequency is raising. I use that in most of my songs, I think, something like that for the second half of the build. The start of the build has this 808 sweep. And then there's a few risers. The main riser is just noise. And then there's the lead that I recorded to audio, and I pitched it up. Or I pitched this one down 1 octave. So now there's 2 of these playing. One is up an octave, one is down an octave. Second half of the build has this string rise, it's more high pitched. And this is in the drop. So it's kind of a nice layer to add to the build because it's kind of teasing the string a little bit, even though you don't really hear it in the build or the drop. There's a vocal right before the build. Let me know in the comments if you know where that vocal is from. There's 3 parts to the lead in the build. There's a brass stab every 2 bars, and that's in the drop, so it's good to tease it here too. There's this main stab that's layered with the brass. The brass is kind of just a backup for this main stab that plays every 1 bar. This stab is one of the main elements in the drop, so it's good to tease it beforehand. And there's this main lead. We're bringing it in with some EQ automations and reverb automations. And it's playing the rhythm from the start of the drop. In Brostep songs, I'll usually use that for the buildup. I'll tease the rhythm of the drop, but just play the rhythm that's in the first bar or maybe the first 2 bars. And then halfway through the drop, speed it up and play just the first half bar instead of the first bar. And then we transition into the drop. A lot of the times in these songs, I'll use a tom fill or a sub impact and a tom. And then a noise layer. This layer is just the snare with a lot of reverb that's flattened. This part of the song is really important because it's a good way to transition between sections of the song, and you really need this part of it to have a lot of impact. So you do want a couple of layers, usually an impact and a tom and some white noise. You can use anything really, but you do want this part to sound good, and you want it to be ducking any vocals that are playing at the same time here, which is this vocal. And then we transition into the drop. We will start with the drums. They sound like this. Standard Brostep kick pattern. If you don't know what that is, it's the kick on every downbeat of every beat, plays right at the start, a snare or a clap halfway through the bar. At least that's a good start for a Brostep drum loop. There's shaker fill, the reversed snare with reverb, and a snare layer. The main kick is a pretty generic basic kick. It is tuned, I believe, to F, which is the key of this song. And then I have erosion on it to give it some top end because this kick really doesn't have a lot of top end. And so you can just add noise to it. You'll hear what it sounds like as I increase it. I just added barely any noise. The snare is pretty low. A lot of Brostep songs will have the fundamental of the snare below 300. It doesn't have to be that low, but it does work to give more emphasis to the snare. And then I have a snare layer. It's just that same snare with reverb on it, and then it's just the high end of the snare. So the snare is basically 2 layers. You got your main layer, and then the top layer to give it the reverb, and then also things won't be sidechained to the top layer, and then I can play around with the top layer and do other things with it, like reverse it and pitch it up and down. The percussion is pretty simple. Just a ride and a shaker and a hat. The way it's structured is the first 2 bars are kind of basic. It's supposed to be building a little bit of tension, and then the hi-hat plays a lot more often. That's supposed to be like the crazy section, and then it's back into the chill section. And it basically alternates between those two, building a little bit of tension and release there. Yeah. We'll get into the drop. It sounds like this. The main sound is basically this bass stab, and then it switches to the lead. In Brostep, a lot of the times it's good to start with having a stab, something that plays on the downbeat that's consistent, that the listener can kind of latch onto, and use as like their home base for referencing where we're at in the song and what's happening. So every time they hear this stab, they know, okay, the melody's kind of restarting. And between the stabs, we have two leads. And we're alternating between those two leads to give it some variation. They sound similar, but they're slightly different, but then they're processed the same. Both of these leads go into a group that has a shifter that is pitching up the fine tuning 20 hertz and then bringing it back down. So that's kind of building some tension and release too. You don't really hear it in the song that much, but I think subconsciously you pick up that it's getting pitched up and it sounds more dissonant and it sounds like less normal, and then you bring it back down, back to normal for the release. There is a layer that's just the stab reversed. Also, playing along with those leads, we have some glitches. And I made these by just putting these leads through a phaser and a grain delay. We can recreate that here. Basically, anything that has a feedback knob you can create glitches with, and you'll probably want to do that for background ambiance layers. So I have this, it's basically just a phaser, and a lot of it is randomized. And then I just record that to audio and chop it up, keep the good parts. Do the same thing with a grain delay. And then I will have these layers duck the stab and the kick. It's best if you don't have to duck them, if they're already EQ'd in a way that they're not interfering with the leads. But in this case, they were causing everything to just be too messy, so I am just using fades to duck, and then I'm also using Shaperbox to do transient shaping, just to cut the volume when the kick and snare hits. It's going to be sidechained again, but this just gives it a little bit extra cut to let the leads cut through a little more, even when they're being sidechained. We're just cutting these glitches more. The brass is kind of doing the same thing. It's ducking the stab, and there's an EQ automation that cuts the lows when the stab plays, and then afterwards lets a little bit more in. Because at this point in the song, the brass is the main lead. A lot of the time, it's good to put a saturator on your brass, even if you just put it on a really low setting. It's good to have. There are some more layers here. Just a white noise layer that plays with the stab, a vocal shot. It's so quiet, I don't think you can hear it in the song at all. A string. It's just playing F, that's the key that the song is in, and then it plays again, and it gets pitched up. And that's building more tension. Pretty much every layer in this song, you want to have some kind of variation to build tension and then release. There's this white noise layer. It's really quiet. And these 4 background layers go into a group that has a gate on it, and that gate is sidechained to the hi-hat. But it's in the reverse order. It's actually making it a little bit louder whenever the hi-hat hits. Usually you wouldn't do it like that. You would have it be a little bit more quiet when the hi-hat hits. That's the first section of the first drop, and then we transition into the second section. So here there's a completely different set of leads. It starts with this glitch sound that was used in the intro, and then it switches to a different bass. Then halfway through that section, we switch into a different bass. Just to give some variation. The way I made these glitches is with Spectral Resonator, and then I set the carrier to be MIDI, and then I set this MIDI track as the carrier. So this piano is turned off, it's muted, but it does have the MIDI that's playing the melody. And you're able to use Spectral Resonator to basically tune whatever's going through it to this melody. And we'll get to that, but in the second drop I actually use that on the leads, and so I'll be able to show you then how that actually works. And the way I made this glitch is I took all of these leads, all of the layers and the bass and the brass, and I ran it through the Spectral Resonator and recorded it. So it's playing the melody. And then halfway through, we just switch and we play the melody with an actual bass. So I can use MIDI and then flatten it and get a little bit more control over it. Yeah, this section took a lot of work. Originally, it was just these bizarre sounding glitches. And it sounds kind of cool, but I needed there to be more rhythm. Otherwise, I don't know, it just sounded so out of place and unexpected, which is good, but a little bit too uncontrolled. It almost sounds like I made it on accident and it's not even supposed to be there. We switched to a different sub bass. This is just a respace, and it's just so I can have it play the melody to make it sound more coherent. I forgot to mention in the drop, I have a separate sub. It's just playing a saw. And it's playing every time these other leads play. Just so I can have a little bit more control over the sub bass. Then there's a separate layer for growl. The drums are a little bit different here. We switch to a different hi-hat. And then this glitch is sidechained to that hi-hat. And this time you can see the gate is flipped, so it's actually turning the volume down every time the hi-hat plays, just to give it a little bit more rhythm and make it sound a little bit more controlled. We are not playing the snare on the first 2 bars to build a little bit of tension. And then as we transition out of the drop into the second verse, we are using a washout with reverb. So we're turning the amount of reverb up to give it that washed out sound. The second verse sounds like this. It's just this ARP mostly. This ARP is also playing during the second half of the drop, but then here it is a polymeter, so it's basically stretched out to double the length, so it switches from sounding like twice as fast to twice as slow. If you've ever played the game Subnautica, this section of the song reminds me of the music in there. We have another ARP come in. This was originally going to be the main ARP, but I couldn't get it to sound right. I put downsample distortion on it, and it sounds like some type of percussion, which works pretty well when we bring in that verse saw again. And this tonal ambiance. And then there's that same drum loop from the first verse. And then as we transition to the second build, we keep the tonal ambiance. It gets pitched up. That sounds like this. So at this point, this main triangle, this one is down an octave compared to the first build. It's still getting lowered another octave with shifter and then getting raised an octave for the second half. But the note that originally plays is 1 octave lower. And then the riser in the second build is that same thing, but it's 1 octave higher. The drums for the build are the same: kick, percussion loop, snare. And then the risers are the same, except for that triangle, which is raised an octave. The leads in this build sound different. And you can see here that is happening because we are running them through the spectral resonator. And you can see here I have the MIDI mode turned on and set to the carrier, which just means that this MIDI is controlling the melody that we're running it through. So this is what it sounds like with it off and then on. So you can hear it's following this melody. And then we use that throughout the drop. So it'll be playing that same melody. That wasn't in the first drop, but it is in the second drop. So as we transition to the second drop, it sounds like this. At one point in this drop, you can hear the lead change. It is going through a formant filter with Serum 2 effects. It's also going through a flanger with the safe bass turned up because I didn't want it to affect the low end of these leads because it makes it sound too muddy. There is some EQ automations going on, just going along with the rhythm of these notes that are playing here, just to kind of shape the transients a little bit more and shape the rhythm a little bit more, cut out a little bit of the high end, just to kind of clean it up and make it sound a little more rhythmic and controlled. That same thing is applied to the sub, just with different EQ shapes to make the sub bass and the leads sound like they are the same thing. The rest of this drop is the same as the first. At halfway, instead of playing the vocal sample, we kind of use a variation of the brass. It's kind of the brass played with synth brass. Kind of sounds like a video game sound effect a little bit. Going through a chorus this time, and then shaping the brass a little bit to make room for the synth. I think that's a pretty good trick in Brostep music, is to wildly change whatever the lead is and almost go into like a different genre, just something totally unexpected. That's not really what's happening here. It's not really super obvious that it's a different lead, but I think it's a nice touch. And then we transition into the post drop. The ARP here has an auto filter, and I'm also automating the cutoff position of the auto filter. So it's a bandpass that's letting more highs through and then lows. And then we're automating that cutoff to let more highs through and then less lows through, just to give it more variation. And then we are washing the ARP out, because we don't want it to play with some of these other leads because it will just get too messy. You don't want to just cut it to silence because then it sounds unnatural. There's some variation in this part here. We're starting with this bass, and then the second half is this bass, just to give it a little bit of variation in the second half of the drop compared to the first. And then we wash that out. We wash the drums out a little bit with reverb. And that's just automating the reverb dry wet and cutting some of the lows and some of the highs. For the post-drop effects, these are really important. Super low impact, super high downlifter, and a transition effect. Sometimes it's good to use a riser here or some kind of synth effect to transition to. But the most important thing is that you have this impact and downlifter to just let the listener know that the drop is over and that this is like now a super chill section of the song. I'll talk a little bit about the processing here. The build drums, the verse drums, they all go into the same group. That group has a little bit of reverb on it, just to kind of glue everything together a little bit. And then there's dynamic EQ, imaging, and saturation, just to make the lows a little bit more mono, the highs a little bit wider, and then saturating the width. And that same process goes into the verse. We have a little bit of reverb to kind of glue everything together, doing dynamic EQing, controlling the width, saturating the width. Then that same thing on the drop group, which includes the undercarriage, the layers, the noise, the bass, the leads. All of that goes through some imaging to control the width, and then exciter to saturate the width. That all goes to the main channel, where I have a glue compressor, which is just doing a little bit of compression, only like 3 decibels of compression. The maximum amount it could do is 5, because we don't want to be doing very much compression at all at this point on the main channel. That being said, you'll have to, because all these groups are limited at 0. Pretty much everything is going to 0 decibels, and then the main channel is also going to 0 decibels. So when you try and cram, you know, 10 groups in that are all at 0 decibels, your output is going to be more than 0. And so we have a compressor here just to kind of cut everything down a little bit. But it's okay that it goes to 0, because this is Brostep and we want it to be loud. So at the very end of this process, we run it through some dynamic EQ and then a soft clipper. And this is one of those times where you have to use trial and error and just push it too hard to figure out what is too much soft clipping, what's too much distortion, and what is not enough. It's good to play around with that when you're making the song and not do that like just at the very, very end, because you don't want to get to the very end and figure out that when you clip everything, it all sounds messed up. So it's good to check that throughout. When I export the final version of the song, I will have that clipper turned off. And that's it for this one, y'all. I'm gonna let the second drop play out, and then I will let the video end. Once again, if you want to listen to the finished version of this song, I will put a link to the streaming in the description. But for now, if you liked the video, let me know in the comments. If you thought it was a good video and you learned something, you can like and subscribe. For now, I'm just gonna let this song play out. Peace out, y'all.
God's water.